Hey everyone, welcome back. So today we're going to tackle compression for classical guitar. So let's get into it. But first, don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't already. It would really help support the channel. Compression is probably the most confusing concept to get down when you first start recording. And it also doesn't help that in classical guitar recording, it's probably the least used effect. My goal for this video is to tell you exactly what compression is and maybe give you some situations or examples of when you might want to use compression in your recordings. That being said, I can't stress enough how much you're actually going to just have to open your compressor plugin in your own DAW and just practice. It's probably the hardest effect to learn how to use, and you have to kind of train your ear to be able to hear if it's working or not. So essentially, compression means you're just taking the waveform of your audio and compressing it to a smaller dynamic range. As a classical musician, we don't generally want to apply too much compression because we work so hard to get the dynamics out of our performance, and you really don't want to mess that up. However, there are some instances where your recording can be too dynamic and kind of make it hard to listen to for most people. I think we've all listened to some kind of recording, whether it be an orchestra or a solo guitar performance, and everything's fine until they hit a really loud Raschiato and your speakers distort or it just like takes your head off. That would be one of those times. Now, it can also be a problem if your recording is too dynamic, because when you go to mastering and you try to make your track loud enough for people to actually listen to without having to, crank their volume too high, you end up with a situation where it's too dynamic to where the loudest section doesn't clip, but the rest of the file is way too quiet to listen to. And this is where compression can help even out your dynamics. So that way it's still dynamic enough to where you get the impression of the volume changes, but not enough to where that listener's constantly having to keep turning up and down their volume control. Let me open up a session and I'll show you what I mean. All right, so I'm in Studio One, and this is my recording of Asturias by Isaac Albéniz. So as you can see looking at the waveform, this track is very, very dynamic. You've got the loud Raschiato section, and then the tremolo section falls way, way beneath that. Now, I'm not exactly saying that, in this piece particular, I would apply this much compression, if any at all. But it is kind of a good example to show you what can happen when you have a really loud Raschiato, and then the rest of the actual peaks are relatively small. So let me go through the compressor and then show you what each setting does. So let me turn this on, and depending on the compressor that you have, it will look a little bit different. The user interface differs depending on the compressor and the DAW, and if it's like an analog emulation or something like that. This is a pretty standard stock compressor. So no matter what DAW you're using, it should be fairly similar to this one. So the controls that we are going to use are going to be the threshold, ratio, attack, release, and then the makeup gain. For right now, don't worry about the mix, don't worry about the sidechain thing, don't worry about the stereo link and look ahead and the knee. For most things that you're going to be using a compressor for classical guitar, unless you're advanced, you're not going to be using a lot of these functions. So basically, the way this works is that this gives you a visual readout over what exactly is happening. So the way a compressor works is that it has a threshold, meaning this nice little dot here that you can see. I can move it up, move it down like that. And that's the point at which the compressor starts actually working. So the way this works is you set a ratio, which essentially is how much compression is being applied. I don't want to get too technical with it, but essentially if you have a ratio of say 1:1, that means the compressor is not working at all. If you have a ratio of 2:1, that's a very, very gentle setting, and that basically means that for every 2 decibels that go over the threshold, it gets compressed by 1. And if you go up to a 5:1, that's pretty heavy. If you go all the way up to 21, you're just basically squishing the life out of your track. So to keep it very practical for classical guitar purposes, I would really recommend a nice gentle 2:1 ratio or a 3:1 ratio. So I'm going to set the compressor just back to about a 2:1 ratio. And now once you set that, for classical guitar, without getting super technical, basically the attack is how quick the compressor acts and turns down your signal, and the release is how long it takes for the compressor to turn off. So for classical guitar, I like to set it to maybe 15 to 20 milliseconds, something like that. Not too fast. If you set it too fast, like 10 milliseconds, basically what'll happen is it'll actually turn down the initial attack of your note. So you'll get this kind of like sound every time you pluck a string. You really don't want that. So I just kind of set it to, maybe, let's go back to like 15, somewhere, 18's good. And then on release, usually about 25, something like that. You don't want it too quick, otherwise the compressor is really not working at all. And you also don't want it too long, because if you have like a 2-second compressor time, it'll actually hold the compression for 2 seconds. So I'm going to switch this back to a more normal setting. And if your compressor has a makeup gain, like auto function, just click the auto button. Because what happens is that when you're using a compressor, like I said, for every 2 decibels that go over the nice little threshold, like say here, for every 2 decibels that go over, it gets turned down 1. So what happens is that it compresses your audio, but it makes it quieter. So you have to kind of bring it gradually back up to the volume that it was before. So let me start playing around with it, and hopefully it makes a little bit more sense. So if I play the audio, I'm just going to steadily bring the threshold down, and you'll start seeing how much gain reduction is actually being applied, or how much compression is happening, with a little yellow bar that'll drop down here. So let me play it and you'll see what I mean. Now notice towards the end that the yellow bar was always present. That is a huge no-no. What I want to do is make my threshold conservative enough to where I see a little bit of a flash of gain reduction every time the loud peak hits, but it shuts off entirely for all of this stuff. Because I don't want to squash the entire thing, I just want to take the tops off of these just to make the average volume just a little bit more consistent. So what I'm going to do is go back up and then gradually drop it to where I just see a little bit of gain reduction. And I do mean a little, like it's really never going to go past like -3 on the gain reduction meter. So let's try that again. Like that. And it's just a really quick little snap of the gain reduction meter. Now you notice that when I start bringing that down, it gets quieter. Now, if I was doing this manually, what I would have to do is play it and then turn the compressor on and off to see what the volume difference is. Like that, just so they match. I don't want to make the track quieter. I just want to, pull these down so that eventually I can actually make the track louder. So if you have an auto button, generally that works pretty well. It just automatically makes up for how much gain is getting reduced here. Now, let me just demonstrate visually what exactly is happening here. So I'm going to compress it a little bit more than usual. And I'm going to render this track out, and hopefully visually on the waveform you can see exactly what's happening with the difference between these loud peaks and then the average volume of the track. So you can see in this one, basically on the loudest section, there's this huge gap between this and then the rest of it. Now if I mix this down and I look at what happens when the compressor's actually been mixed to the track, so you can see it's kind of been compressed to where the difference between the loudest peak and then here is not quite so much. Now generally speaking, this would be way too much compression, because I do want a lot more dynamic range between the loudest Raschiatos and then the rest of it. But it shows visually exactly what's happening. Instead of having this really loud kind of crash and then a huge gap between there, you get basically something that's a little bit more evened out. And this can help you if you watch my last video on how to make your tracks louder. You can turn your tracks up louder because this peak isn't hitting the ceiling before everything else. You can compress these top parts and then turn your track up a little bit louder without the entire thing being completely wrecked or having this be an appropriate volume and then this being whisper quiet. So I hope this explanation helps. I might go into more detail in future videos. I know compression is probably the most confusing aspect, at least for me when I started recording, but I hope this helped you get a little bit more of an understanding over how compression works. All right, that's my time. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you have any questions, comments, or topics you want me to cover in future videos like this one, please leave them in the comments down below. I'll see you guys in the next video.